Hi, my name is John McMaster here in my Silicon Valley garage.
Hey, and I'm Yusuf. We're Geek Moniker coming to you live this week, and we're going to be talking about wire crimps. So, John, what was your experience this week with them?
Well, let me ask you before I go into kind of a deep dive, why don't you tell me what is your experience with wire crimping? Have you done crimping before in any sort of forms?
I did. In fact, the project we did quite a few months back now, I had to go, get some wire crimps because we were making some connections with, I think, the Molex MT100 connectors.
Yes,
And yeah, and that's what I needed to do with those.
that's right. And I think in the end, we went with a solderable one because I didn't have the right crimp tool for those, at least at the time. And I guess I would say that is most people's inclinations is to go with solderable connectors instead of crimp connectors. Would you say that's kind of typically what your go-to is?
I don't actually use crimps when connecting wires. Usually I just solder them. Uh,
Right, that's what I mean. I feel that most people don't go to crimps, but if you remember at Skybox, we actually made a transition from soldered connections to crimped connectors, which you may or may not have been aware of. Are you by chance aware of that, or more specifically, why we did that?
no, why did you guys do that?
I believe the primary reason was that it's just a lot faster. Once you kind of get a crimping workflow set up, you just kind of go, and you're done. Versus soldering, you kind of gotta, do all these sort of things. I would go so far to say that the area where I think we get most people crimping are uh, cars, so automobiles. Have you used connectors that maybe look like these before? I think these are the most common ones that you're going to find.
No, I haven't.
So these are, I think maybe call these bullet connectors, not to be confused with the RC ones. And then these are spade connectors. And these are used in a lot of automobile applications. And most commonly, you would use a tool kind of like this. This is a very basic crimp tool. And this is kind of where I had done crimping in the past. But one of the problems that I've run into, and I don't know if I could demonstrate here, is that a lot of times when I try to crimp these connections are unreliable. And it takes a lot of force. And while I've seen a lot of potential in crimp style connectors, it's just been a little bit elusive to get a reliable connection. Because you can just kind of yank the wires out, which is not good when you're trying to do something reliable, right?
You know, that reminds me, I'm not sure what the price was, but I believe that like reputable crimping tools are pretty expensive for what you think they are. They look like just a couple of pliers, but I think
Yes.
if I remember correctly, they run in like hundreds of dollars.
Yes, in fact, I think the MTA 100 official crimp tool, we had a discussion with Robert Wu, I think it was on Twitter a while back, and I think he was saying something like the cheap tool was, like I don't know, like $30 that you get off of like Amazon, but then if you got like the official Molex one, it was, something much more expensive, and then if you got like the automatically like does everything for you, just insert it and go. I think that one was like over $500 or something, pretty expensive. Although that one was a
Maybe,
little bit, yeah.
yeah, maybe there's something to it, I guess, if you get the good quality tool.
Yeah. So on that note, so after using these for a while, my next thing was I did get what I would call a mid-range tool. So this is like a fairly nice ratcheting, and it's supposed to do all that magic wonderland of like let's get a nice crimped cable. And I've had this for a while, and I actually originally got it for coax, not for these style. But guess what? Can you imagine what happened when I tried to use this and I compared it to my cheap little tool here?
You went through the crimp.
Oh, you mean like crushed it entirely?
Yeah.
No, although I have wondered. Oh man, I should be really careful. I have wondered though, because it ratchets. For our viewers who may be watching, there is an emergency release on the back if you ever get into that
Oh,
unfortunate
that's good to
situation.
know.
um, but no, good guess. Actually, it's the opposite problem. It actually turns out that when I crimp something, I don't know if I have a wire here. It actually doesn't tend to apply enough force. In fact, I find that if I try to crimp these, it just rips out. and I don't really get a solid connection. So as much as I thought that this kind of fancier tool was going to kind of make my life perfect and that missing thing in my life, it turns out that actually I've had a lot better experiences with this thing and just kind of wailing on it with my fingers than trying to use this marvel of mechanical technology over here, which I think was a little bit disappointing.
Although, is the green tool actually spec'd for the crimps you're using?
Kind of, yeah. So this is a relatively high-end tool. So these are dies that can be taken out. It's a modular tool. And so I have a whole kind of set here. I originally got this for coax and other kind of similar connectors. But yeah, this is an official die, and it's supposed to be well designed for these type of connectors. If you even see, although the colors don't quite line up, you can see that there's like a little purplish red there. There's a blue, there's a yellow. And that's depending on the shell size you use. Let's see, I think I have a little yellow one. This is for heavier gauge wire. The yellow is heavier gauge. This kind of violet red, that's for a little bit of lighter gauge wire. And actually, in my experience, if you're doing the heavy gauge wire, this tool, to be fair, does seem to work really well. It's the lighter gauge wire that is these purplish reds that it really seems to struggle with. So that's the kind of the first tangent here. I think my lesson is I really do like these crimp connectors, but I guess I'm just really disappointed. And I watched some videos yesterday trying to see if I was the only person having this problem. And it sounds like this is a common problem, that despite all of these nice tools that kind of promise to give you nice crimps, auto style connectors, these sort of spades, it seems like the simple hand tools, as simple as they are, actually generally seem to do better than these fancy tools, which I found kind of interesting.
Do you think maybe it's a technique thing? Because, like cars do use these, right? And the connections seem fairly solid, especially in, they do vibrate a lot as well.
They do, but I think that's because a lot of people are using these manual tools, which you can control the pressure a lot better on just by kind of, your iron grip for mechanic, turning wrenches, whatever. I honestly can make a lot more reliable connectors on this than I can with this.
But
And
how do you think they do it in the factories? I mean, I don't think people are going to be hand crimping them, right?
It's possible that there's nicer tools than this, although I would say this is a reputable brand. This is Paladin Tools, also known as Greenlee or something like that. Yeah, Greenlee. This is considered a reputable brand, so it's possible that there's something nicer that you can get than this, but I really couldn't tell you.
Cool.
The next thing I was going to say is I also have these terminal blocks. Have you seen things like these?
Yeah, the screw connectors.
So the problem with these is if you try to just kind of put in a stripped wire in there, something like this, and you screw it in there, this fatigues over time. So not very good for reliability. If you kind of tug on this connector, it actually can break off. So what do you need to do to reduce fatigue on a wire?
Mechanically, add some, I guess, backing to it, right? A crimp.
Yeah, some sort of a strain relief, is what I would say. So what they do, and this is actually my favorite thing to learn about recently. I find this tool very entertaining. This is the one in our picture. So this is a special tool that if I were to take a little shell, so they look kind of like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert this wire, so twist it a little bit, and put it in there. So now you see that it slipped over and it's still kind of round. And I'm going to stick this in there and do this. And then now you see it's been kind of crushed into this kind of squarish thing.
Yep.
So now this has strain relief from this plastic sheath here. It's a very solid connector because it's been crushed. It may be a little bit hard to see in there. And this provides kind of industrial grade connectors that you can use if you wanted some sort of high reliable industrial system. And this was the main thing I was after recently because I'm building some kind of custom industrial machines and I needed to do a bunch of connections like this for quick prototyping. And I thought this was going to significantly increase the reliability of the machine. But I had never used one of these tools before, so very interesting to learn about it. The last bit, I would say in crimping, that was my adventure before this. Have you ever seen a crimp tool that looks like this?
Yes.
Do you know what the difference is between this tool and this tool? Because I think they kind of visually look similar, but they're actually quite different.
I would think the connector would be different, right?
That is quite true. I would say though, this is like a straight crushing connector. So this is when you have this sort of thing, which has ribs in there. And the idea is, you have these edges that are internal to this, and you just want to crush this as hard as possible onto the wire you stick in there. This, on the other hand, though, what it's for is you get these little itty bitty, and these may be hard to see on camera, inserts that go into a connector. So this particular type, I had a little housing here. I guess it's kind of disappeared, but these are inserted into a housing. So imagine you have some sort of housing like this, and these are the contacts that actually slide in here after you attach them to wires. But the trick is that if you look on this, and hopefully you can see this, that there's actually little V grooves on this tool. Can you see those V grooves?
Yes.
So the idea behind those V grooves is as you crimp this down, it actually curls up the metal and it kind of bends around and bites down on the wire. And so if you size this correctly for the wire and the right sort of connector you have here, this will bite very strongly down on the wire and give you a very solid connection.
Okay, very nice. Yeah, so
Yeah.
definitely right tool for the right job.
Yeah. Now, talking about the high end versus the low end tools for this, though, in order to use this, which is kind of a low end-ish hand tool, you basically have to crimp them in a two-step process. You first do a crimp where you're doing the actual wire to make a solid electrical connection. And then you do a second crimp where you're crimping it onto the plastic insulation, and that provides the strain relief. So kind of a two-step process, but relatively quick, generally quicker than soldering, and provides a solid connection that you can kind of modularly take in and out of your connector housings.
Okay, very cool. The one thing when I was looking for the connectors and the little crimps to go into the connectors, I had a really hard time figuring out which one pairs well with which. Like it seems like there are a ton of variants out there, and there's no real easy way to say, hey, this is the one I need. Like, has that been your experience?
Yeah, in fact, that was part of the discussion on Twitter, was talking about, what are good connector choices out there, with so many out there. And that got started on the MTA 100. And then I believe at the last reverse engineering meetup, or maybe a few of them ago, there was also a discussion about what is a good connector for general purpose sort of power connectors. And as that, it became very clear there are a few favorites. So we talked about the Microfit 3 series, for example, which is a good general purpose connector. And you'll find that on quite a lot of pieces of equipment. So I think the general advice was learn a few of these common families and stick to them if at all possible. Because generally you're going to be able to get advice on, what's the proper crimp tool to use, what are mating pins that go into these sockets, and getting that kind of whole ecosystem working. And I think that's the key thing that makes crimpable connectors really intimidating, is understanding how the crimp tool and the housing and the insert and all that fits together.
Yeah, and the one thing I found as well is, I frequent some of these RC car plane, channels, and they have a whole set of connectors that they like. They're almost standardized in the RC world. Um, those might be something to look at too. Like, I guess they're not super high power, like if it's an industrial machine versus an RC car, but they do push quite a lot of power through for small applications.
Sure. So when I think of RC stuff, gosh, so there's the JST connectors, bullet connectors are very popular. I can't remember the names of all of those, but I do know that there's a huge divide between the people who like to crimp and solder those. And part of the issue with RC that I've also seen is some of those connectors are quite small. And so in order to get them working, I think you might even need a better, maybe this is good enough. This has a pretty small one here. But the skill required, maybe you have to work under a microscope. And I think that's also part of the issue there, is it gets harder and harder as you get those little itty small RC connectors.
Okay, very cool. Hey, and before I forget, real quick shout out to Carlos. He's been one of our early, viewers, and nice to have you around.
Hi, Carlos. Welcome. Well, I think that's mostly what I had for today, unless you had anything else to add on.
No, I think that was good. I think I would like to, I guess, circle back on how do we get better connections, the ones that you have been having trouble with? Because I think
Oh,
there's got to be a way to do that, right?
yeah. So the general advice, yeah, I probably should have talked about that. So the general advice, which seemed to actually work very well for me, was use the hand crimper and don't do it one time, but do it like 3 times. So I found that if I go, kind of 3 times and really grilled it on, that actually makes a pretty reliable connection that I can kind of yank on. I don't know if I could do a live demo here. I could try. So I'll get a little wire stripper here. Might as well, right?
Sure.
So I've got my wire stripper here. I'm gonna just strip off a length of wire. And I'm going to just first demonstrate what happens if I use the automatic stripper. So I'm gonna just put this in here and the automatic crimper, and just put this in here, kind of line it up on the die. Hopefully you can see that there. And you're gonna hear it ratchet down, hopefully. I don't know if you heard that noise.
Yep.
But anyways, so now I would say that visually, this looks like a pretty solid connector. But at least based on my experience, if I pull this, okay, yeah. So it was a little bit better than normal, but you should not be able to pull this off with your hand like that, like I just did, not a lot of force. So I'm gonna try to do the same thing, except now I'm gonna insert it back in. And I'm gonna go over to the hand tool, and using both hands, I am just going to really kind of wail on it, basically. So iron grip, really. So that's a second location. And then I've done it on the far side and the close side. And now I'm doing it in the middle. So kind of squeeze on it really hard. And at least in my experience, now that I've done that, this is very solid. Like I'm pulling on this very hard. And this is not coming out. So I would trust this connection. So yeah, I should have mentioned that once I got that methodology down, I'm able to make a pretty quick connection. And you also saw I did that pretty quick, versus soldering. You might have to line things up a little bit more, get the iron ready. This is pretty quick to do.
Okay, and you're not afraid of, I guess, biting into the insulation or the metal or fatiguing it too much when you do it really hard?
No, so the way that this works, this may not be obvious, is there is an insulation sheath on this wire. And if you look inside of these, I don't know how well this will show up on camera. You see there's a hole down the middle?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the wire goes down, and that's at a different level than where the metal is that you're biting down. So the insulation on this wire is actually going to stop before it goes into the crimp area.
Okay, very cool. Hey, this was super fun. Thanks for the info, John.
No problem. If there are no questions for others, I think that may be a good point to stop.
Okay, we'll see you next week.
All right, stay safe, everyone.
And remember to change your filters.